Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interaction between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTVC. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue. He's America's best-known short story writer. He was known to the world as O. Henry, and he once lived in Austin. Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And today we have opportunity to turn our attention to the life and work of William Sidney Porter, better known by a pseudonym O. Henry. We do so because Porter had an active part in the local scene at the turn of the century, and the issue with which he struggled is very much part of our life today: suicide. Following his conviction for embezzlement in the federal court in Austin and suffering other devastating personal losses, Will, as he was known to his friends, seriously considered taking his own life. His will to live proved to be the spiritual triumph which made possible the literary legacy which the world has since come to love so. With us today are several persons who will help us appreciate his crisis and creativity. There is Dr. Jenny Lynn Porter, author of a biography on O. Henry entitled Time to Write, and Diane Smart, Friends of the O. Henry Museum Vice President. We have others who will be helping us recreate something of William Sidney Porter's life, but we're going to first turn our attention to you, Dr. Porter, and have you tell us, if you would please, something of how you happened to come to have your interest in O. Henry.
I am fortunate in being part of the O. Henry family. O. Henry was my father's cousin. And about 30 years ago, I met the great biographer and collector of O. Henriana, Judge Truman E. O'Quinn, and I think he infected me with his love and feeling for O. Henry, so I've had it ever since.
Judge O'Quinn has been in the community quite some time with that interest, hasn't he?
Since 1922, and over a period of 50 years, he collected the greatest amount of information, pictures, first editions, furniture about O. Henry that we have in the world.
Is that right?
The greatest collection is here, not in Greensboro, but here.
Oh, And he co-authored this book with you.
Yes, he did.
And could you just give us a picture of the cover of that? And I was intrigued by the subtitle that says, How William Sidney Porter Became O. Henry. Could you explain a little bit of that?
Yes. The historian Walter Prescott Webb told Judge O'Quinn that someone should put together the stories that O. Henry wrote in prison and call it Time to Write.
Oh.
So we put together the stories which he wrote there from 1898 until 1901, in that short period of time. There are 12 stories, and they give us a great picture of the inner life of O. Henry in those crucial years of his development. We wanted to show how he came from being a newspaper man to the great master of the short story in America. You know, he's a supremely American author.
And I have a question to ask you, Diane. I know that as on the board of the Friends of the Museum, that you said that he is well known throughout the world, as evidenced by the visitors that come to the museum.
Yes, we have visitors from all over the world. Most of the visitors we have are from Japan, which is surprising. One day we were there at a board meeting and we had some visitors come in and they showed us their Japanese tour book written in Japanese, which specifies O. Henry's museum, and he's very popular there. Also in Russia, they've also had a stamp commemorative for him.
A stamp in the Soviet Union that has O. Henry's picture on it.
Yes,
Is that
it's
right?
in the collection at the museum.
Uh-huh.
And very few writers outside of Russian writers are allowed to be written or read by Russians, and so we feel very privileged to have O. Henry as one of our writers there.
So the visitation is not just from people in this country, but from all over the world.
No, all over the world. In fact, we're surprised how many people in Austin don't know where our museum is at.
Is that right?
Yes.
And where is it at while we're talking about it?
It's on 409 East 5th Street.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want another landmark, we're next to the fire station, and around the corner is the locomotive,
Mm-hmm.
which will soon be active again, which is part of the O. Henry Museum collection.
I think it'd be helpful to just take note of what the number is. If people want to call and get information about that, let's
I
not
don't know the
forget that.
number.
You don't remember the number? of
No,
the
I don't know the number. It's on the screen over there.
Oh, all right. So we have it listed for us here. Good. And as we've talked about the museum here in town, that was his home. And can you just kind of fill in a little bit of the sense of what it was like when he was here and how he contributed to the Austin scene, Dr. Porter?
Yes, and in commenting on what Diane said, I might tell you that about a year ago, a crew came from Japan and filmed in my living room the manuscript of The Fog and Santone, and Judge O'Quinn talking about it. They came all the way from Tokyo to set it up, went back, came back again, and filmed it on a program called The Great Collectors of the World.
I see.
Isn't that interesting?
All right. So that just reinforces how much of an influence his work has had abroad. And I think as a program sponsored by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries, it's particularly important to zero in just for a moment on his spiritual life and the faith that was manifest either in his early or later years. Can you share something of that?
Yes, you asked a little about his life. You see, our book is important in that it shows how this young Southerner who spent 16 years in Texas and who wrote nearly 50 stories set in Texas, not many people know that, who wrote almost 300 short stories and who became so famous all over the world. It's interesting as you go along and read these stories to see how much he valued those years in Texas and how much he loved life. He had a tremendous faith, and much of that came from his mother, his college-educated mother, who died when he was little, but he had that great inheritance. He was a descendant of Sir Philip Sidney, of the Sidneys and Worths. His father was a doctor, and his Aunt Lina a school teacher, and he always loved books. He was an illustrator, a violinist, a choreographer. He loved all of the arts. And I think had O. Henry lived, you know, he said, I've never done half of what I could do. I know that if I haven't done half of it. But we think had he lived that he would have been writing musical comedy, writing libretti for him.
Oh, I see. Because it was coming into vogue just about the time his life ended.
But that great faith and the stability of his excellent family line came down with him through all the sorrow and tragedy and sustained him. And he had been taught very well from the time he was a child about the Bible. And he said about immortality, I think we're like little chickens pecking out of our shells.
I see. Well, he has a kind of a sense of eternity about him, I think, in regard both to his work and to his influence as a person. And you seek, Diane, in the museum to keep that memory alive and viable. What are some of the kinds of programs that you have there to do that?
Okay, at the moment we're seeking volunteers to help our curator with acquisition of other properties to preserve the memorabilia that is already there. The museum in itself needs a lot of restoration work outside and inside.
It's part of the Austin Park District.
Yes, it's part of the Austin City Museum Parks Department. We're one of 3 city museums, and the budget does not stretch quite
So that's where the
around.
friends
That's
and the
where the
volunteers
friends
come
and the
in.
volunteers come in.
Right, okay.
We have a different schedule for membership for students, families. Donations are generously sought out. We plan to have a celebration again this year for his birthday in September, and hoping to coincide that with the 150-year birthday of Austin.
The sesquicentennial.
Yes, you can say that word, not me.
I practice a lot on that.
Well, I went through it before when we were trying to.
Well, now, what about the pun-off? I mean, that's the thing that in the community has become known for the
Yes, we've done that
location.
for over 12 years. And our last pun-off was this last May, and we had a real good write-up in the San Antonio paper on it. We had 21 contestants, and we have it split into 2 divisions. This year we were trying to get the junior high and high school students interested in it, and we're hoping next year that it would work out better. Maybe after seeing this program there'll be some interest in it.
Well, I think that that catches the spirit of the man in terms of his having love for humor, and the surprise endings that we associate with him are part of that. And I think that the downside of his life, in terms of the adverse circumstances that affected him when he was sent to the federal prison in Columbus, Ohio, and I think in your book, Dr. Porter, you mentioned that he went in with defeat and strain of the past 2 years. He lost his young wife, Ethel, 7 months before his trial. He lost his child. He lost his reputation, his job. And a month after his incarceration, you had reported that he wrote this to Ethel's mother, Mrs. Roach, in Austin. It's almost as you could hear O. Henry today if he were with us, saying, "I have tried to reconcile myself
to remaining here for a time, but I'm about at the end of my endurance. There is absolutely not one thing in life, at present or in prospect, that makes it of value. I know all the arguments that could be advanced as to why I should endure it, but I have reached the limit of my endurance. It would be better for everyone else, and 1,000 times better for me, to end the trouble instead of dragging it out."
Well, perhaps the very writing of that letter helped you to overcome your despondency.
Well, writing had always been important to me, and it became especially so during my imprisonment, more than any other time in my life. Had it not been that way, I could have easily used my position as prison pharmacist to end the trouble.
But working those late hours enabled you to have time to write that you'd never had before.
Yes, it is true that much of my life had been spent moving about, from leaving my native North Carolina at age 19 to come to a Texas ranch for a healthier climate, and subsequently to move to Austin, where I must admit I became involved in a whirligig of social activity.
Well, now, what was Austin like back in those days?
Well, a friend of mine described it as a merry place in the 1880s. He wrote the old burg was filled with cowmen, flush with money, roaring to spend it on gambling and booze and women of the night. He recalled how I and my friends were cronies of Bud and Toby Driscoll, and we drank a lot, and we had good credit with Doc Muntic, who he said could look you in the eye and prescribe a pick-you-up that would put backbone on a rope.
Oh, I see. Well, how long were you in the city?
More than 12 years. During that time, I worked as a pharmacist, tried my hand at a cigar store, then became a bookkeeper, then a draftsman in the old state land office, before ending my career in this town as an ill-fated teller at the First National Bank.
But between your work and your play, did you not have any time to write while you were here?
I made some contributions to newspapers and bought a satirical weekly, The Rolling Stone, for which I wrote and illustrated. But the Germans in this town were not happy with my lampoons, and that satirical weekly did not endure. Mostly my early literary efforts were ephemeral.
I see. But I was impressed by the fact that you not only had this talent for writing, but you could draw, that you illustrated this book, Will Barger's Indian Depredations of Texas, that we still have around.
And music. I loved music. From enjoying the classics and Gilbert and Sullivan at the Millet Opera House to playing the piano and singing to my daughter Margaret.
And we were interested to know, too, at the Presbyterian Church downtown here in Austin, that you sang in the choir there, that you blended your voice as a light bass with Mrs. Roach and your wife-to-be, Ethel.
And it was the pastor of that Presbyterian church, Richmond Kelly Smoot, that led Ethel and me in our wedding vows. It was July 1, 1887, when we obtained the wedding license, hired a city carriage, and made our way out to West 6th Street to Reverend Smoot's home. And there he performed the service. His 12-year-old son, Lawrence, was a witness.
And I think that it's important to note that after you were married, you lived on the other side, the east side of Congress, that the home that's still there has been preserved. It's open to visitors and for future generations.
Yes, and anyone who visits there should notice the muslin curtains and the wicker chair that Athol bought with the money that I had saved to send her to the Chicago World's Fair. Instead of taking the trip, she spent it on our house and on me. It was that sacrifice that was later to inspire me to write the story Gift of the Magi.
And I think it's that story that indicates that your faith is not simply a matter of using the Bible as for literary references.
Oh, this was evidence later after Athol contracted tuberculosis, and we were no longer able to sing in the choir. On Sunday mornings, I would help her into the carriage, and we would travel up Brazos Street and stop by the Presbyterian Church, and there, through the open windows, we could hear the choir sing together.
And her subsequent death must have grieved you deeply.
Well, it was not just that I missed her so, but her faithfulness had always given me hope for the future. After the charges for embezzlement were dropped, it was Athol who encouraged me to take the job as columnist for the Houston Post when it was offered. She had hopes for me as a writer beyond newspapers, but she knew I had to leave Austin. And even though not physically well enough to move, she and 6-year-old Margaret nonetheless joined me as I accepted the new job.
And then when the charges were revived, you fled the country.
Shamefully, I must admit it. Yet when word of Athol's imminent death reached me in Honduras, I knew I had to return to be faithful to the one who had been so faithful to me. So I returned to Austin to be with her and to accept arrest. She never withdrew her support from me, despite my weakness for drink, despite my business failures, despite my leaving her. When she died, I entered prison in despair.
And that's what is so amazing to any of us today, to look back upon and to wonder how, with that sense of incredible loss, you were able to leave that prison without bitterness. You were able to go to New York City. The next 9 years, you were writing virtually one story a week, and how that great, incredible creativity could come forward without self-pity and without giving in to the temptation to take your own life. How could you have given that world that unforgettable legacy?
Well, perhaps I should let one of my stories speak. Just remember, I put myself in them. This one especially, which I called The Last Leaf, and in which I had the narrator say, "It was to quaint old
Greenwich Village that the art people came, hunting for north windows and low rents. At the top of a 3-story brick, Sue and Johnsy had their studio. One from Maine and the other from California, they had met at a restaurant on 8th Street, had found their tastes so congenial that the jointly renting the studio resulted. That was in May. In November, a cold, unseen stranger called pneumonia stalked the colony, touching one here and there with his icy fingers. Johnsy, whose blood had been thinned by California zephyrs, was smitten. She lay scarcely moving from her iron bedstead. She had strength only to gaze through the panes of the apartment's Dutch window across at the back side of the brick building on the other side of the street. A doctor was called in for treatment. After several visits, the physician one morning invited Sue into the hallway, saying,
"She has one chance in 10, and that chance is for her to want to live. Your little lady has made up her mind that she is not going to get better. Has she anything on her mind?"
She wanted to paint the Bay of Naples someday.
Paint? Bosh! Has she anything in her mind worth thinking about? A man, perhaps?
A man? Is a man worth? But no, doctor, there's nothing of the kind.
Well, it's a weakness then. I will do everything that science can accomplish, but When my patients start counting the carriages in their funeral procession, I subtract 50% from my curative remedies.
After the doctor had gone, Sue returned to Johnsie's room with a drawing board, thinking Johnsie asleep. As she was quietly sketching, she was startled as she turned to find her roommate with her eyes wide open, looking out the window and counting.
12, 11, 10, 9, 8, 7.
Sue looked solicitously out the window. What was there to count? Only a gnarled old ivy vine could be seen, climbing halfway up the brick wall. The cold breath of autumn had stricken its leaves until its skeleton branches clung, almost bare, to the crumbling wall.
What is it, dear?
6. They're falling faster now. 3 days ago, there were almost 100. But now, and there goes another. There are only 5 left.
5 what, dear?
Leaves on the ivy vine. When they all fall off, I must go too. I have nowhere to live. Didn't the doctor tell you? I've known this for 3 days now.
Oh, I've never heard of such nonsense. What have old ivy leaves to do with your getting well?
And there goes another. That means that only 4 are left. I must see the last one fall before it gets dark. Then I must go too.
Johnsy, dear, promise me to keep your eyes closed and not to look out the window until I'm done working.
Yes, but tell me when you are through, because I must see the last one fall. I am so tired of waiting.
Try to sleep. I must call the old Berman up to be my model for the old hermit's picture.
Old Berman was a painter who lived on the ground floor beneath them. He was past 60 and had always been about to paint a masterpiece, but he had never begun it, instead smelling strongly of juniper berry. He earned a little by serving as model to those young artists in the village who could not pay the price of a professional. Sue told him of Johnsie's fancy, how she would, light and fragile as a leaf herself, float away when her slight hold on the world grew weaker. They went upstairs while Johnsie was still sleeping and peered fearfully out of the window at the vine. A persistent cold rain mixed with snow was falling. Sue then pulled the shade down to the windowsill as old Bierman made his way back below. When Sue awoke the next morning, she found Johnsie with dull, wide-open eyes, staring straight at the drawn green shade.
Pull it up. I want to see.
Clearly, Sue obeyed. And lo, after the beating rain and fierce gusts of wind, there yet stood out against the brick wall one ivy leaf, the last on the vine. Still dark green near its stem, but with edges tinged with yellow, it hung bravely from a branch 20 feet above the ground.
I've been a bad girl, Sudie. Something has made that last leaf cling to the wall and has proved my willing to live. It is wrong to want to die. Bring me a little broth now. I must gain my strength back so that I can begin painting the Bay of Naples scene.
The doctor came that afternoon, and afterwards he said to Sue,
With good nursing, she will live. But it's not to be for the old man downstairs. Bierman, his name is. Some kind of artist, I believe. The janitor found him this morning. Icy cold, his clothing and shoes wet through. No one could imagine where he had been on such a dreadful night. But a lantern was found, and a ladder, and a palette with green and yellow colors mixed on it.
yes, Bierman had painted his masterpiece on the wall, by the vine, on the night the last leaf fell.
Yes, his masterpiece indeed, as is this story of O. Henry. For it not only brings together all of the elements of literary excellence, but shows forth how the will to live is sustained by sacrificial love. The truth and fiction found its counterpart in the life of William Sidney Porter, and his endurance beyond the temptation to destroy himself, even before the world could appreciate his genius. Are we not also inspired faithfully ourselves to choose life because of Will's will to live? And in turn, are we not chosen to help others in strengthening their wills? May those who are to come in later generations look back upon us, as biographer Jenny Lynn Porter said of Will Porter in quoting Emily Dickinson, "A death blow is a life blow to some, who till they died did not alive become." Having brought us these scenes which highlighted William Sidney Porter's will to live are Bill Averill, the one to recreate the person of O. Henry himself, Judsonia Green, playing the part of Sue, Elizabeth Cruz, the part of Johnsy, Mike Day, Jr., the part of the doctor, Spring Cobb, the part of Behrman, and from behind the scenes, the narrator, Joe Haggard. We thank each of them, as well as Dr. Jenny Lynn Porter, for being with us, and for Diane Smart from the O. Henry Museum. On behalf of the Austin Metropolitan Ministries, I'm Richard Thompson, thanking you for joining us and inviting you to be with us next week at this time. Peace be with you.